I have a few more helpful hints for new quilters. A few weeks or months ago, I asked some of my Presto Avenue Designs friends to give me some tips on what they think is important for new quilters. And so I put them together and I thought I would put them out to you. They're very simple, and there's only 5 main things that they wanted to mention, I guess. I already did in another video talk about cutting carefully. They stressed that it's important to cut carefully. I already covered that. So now we're going to move on to sewing and the sewing machine, etc. The very first thing that everyone said was, number 1, if you're a new quilter, you need to make sure that you can get that 1/4 inch seam allowance. In order to do that, you need to make sure that you practice and learn and come to know your machine. Every machine is a little bit different, and there are places on your machine there are little spots on your machine, which my machine has a guide mark here. That's what I use. Or sometimes if that's covered up with fabric, I use the side of my foot to guide it. This is my sewing machine close up. I'm showing it to you because I wanted you to see how I gauge a 1/4 inch seam. It depends on what kind of machine you have and what the parts look like. So you need to know your machine. My machine is a Bernina. I have a special 1/4 inch foot, and this is the 1/4 inch foot. I also have a throat plate here, my single hole throat plate, which has marks on it. And these marks are my guide marks for making seams and whatever. So take a look at your machine and make sure that you have something that guides you as far as your seams go. I also usually start with just a piece to get started with. This little piece keeps my starts and finishes in the right way. Okay, so now I've got the foot down. I'm going to lay my piece that I am going to sew a seam, a nice 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to lay it, and I'm laying it right next to this little mark right here. This little mark is sort of between, or it looks like it goes between where this gear is down here. And it lines up with this edge of the sewing machine foot, my 1/4 inch foot. So I'm going to stick it right there. And usually I use my fingers just to feed it in. But as long as I keep my machine feeding and watching this line and watching also the edge of my foot, the edge of my foot needs to be right on the edge of the fabric. You don't want it covering or it's not going. And you also need to watch that your pieces are right together. And that should be a nice 1/4 inch seam. Let's see, I'm going to have to cut a part back here. I'm going to feed this back in for later sewing. And let's see, it's a nice 1/4 inch seam. But that 1/4 inch seam is pretty important as you sew. If you are not making an accurate 1/4 inch seam, that every time you sew some pieces together, your block will either get too big or get too small. Most of the time I think it gets a little too small because you're taking in that amount of your seam allowance. So that's very important. On the other hand, I also had a couple of people suggest that if you're not doing a 1/4 inch seam, whatever you're doing, be consistent with your seam allowance. I think that's important too. If you're sewing a 1/4 inch seam, make sure you're sewing it straight and always doing that same 1/4 inch seam. If you tend to go a little smaller than a 1/4 inch, just make sure that you realize that you're doing that every time, and you may have to adjust your block if you're piecing something. The other thing is learn how to set up your machine so that everything is going nicely. Each machine's a little bit different. I've had times when I would be on a different machine than a Bernina, and the thread didn't wind down through the needle the same way, and boy, I couldn't figure out why my machine wouldn't work. So make sure you know how your machine works, where are the things that you need to do to make it work right. Also, number 3 would be make sure that you watch your tension on your machine, because a lot of times if you're new, you don't realize that the tension is very important. And if you have a 50 weight thread on your machine, then your machine will gauge about a 5 point something tension number, and so it will balance out the tension between the bobbin and the top thread. If you are not, or if you're brand new to this, sometimes you might go to the store and you might get some thread that may be used for, it's called all-purpose thread. Sometimes that thread is not the best for using in your sewing machine, and it will cause some problems on machines. So make sure that you buy quality thread, and usually the best quality threads are sold at quilt shops or online. There's some brand names that are definitely good threads. So that's number 3. Number 4 is, it's helpful before you start if you wind some extra bobbins, and then that they're ready so you don't have to stop. And if you get sewing and you start making mistakes, you can't figure something out, one suggestion is stop for that day, go to bed, things will be better in the morning. And that is true with about any creative thing. Finally, the very last thing that everyone said, I was kind of surprised at this, is they all suggested to be daring. So if you're a new quilter, don't be afraid that you're going to make some mistakes. Be daring. And what they said here was use many fabrics with your quilts. Not just one red fabric when you can have lots of red fabrics. Don't be afraid to try new techniques. What can you do but learn a little bit more? Sometimes you might not like that technique, but at least you've learned something. Another thing is go to classes. Going to classes will help you learn some new things that you may not have even known about, and you'll always learn some little tip that you can use. You can also learn from your friends at quilt retreats or in quilt groups, clubs. Other quilters are the best source of good information. Finally, somebody said reds don't have to match. You can use different reds. Just make sure that you like them. It doesn't matter. And then another person said, well, you have to think about reds. Sometimes using just 1 or 2 reds, different reds, might not work very well. But if you use a lot of them, 25 or so, then nobody will pay any attention. And I think that's true too. So there's 5 good tips about using your sewing machine or about learning to make quilts. And I think the most important one is that last one. Be daring. Try everything you can try, see what you like, and enjoy yourself. You're doing this for fun, and you'll find that you'll have more fun if you try everything you can and just go headfirst into each quilt. These are the people that gave me these good tips. They are other quilters who have been quilting for quite a while. Elaine Leibarger, Susie Swanson, Jeannie Leo, and Mary Strinka. Thank you to those friends of mine. And if you have some tips for other people, be sure to send them in. We can share them anytime. Thanks.